talk, I want to acknowledge the institute where I work, and also Draulio de Araújo, whom I'm going to talk about today. We work at this place in Brazil. It's brand new. It's very exciting. If you happen to be in Brazil and you want to visit the Brain Institute, we'll be very happy to have you there. And we also want to acknowledge the various funding agencies that we have, in particular the federal government of Brazil through CNPq and CAPES, the state government of Rio Grande do Norte through FAPERN, and the PU program that has funded my postdoctoral studies many years ago, and then keeps a link with us. So what I'm going to talk here today are some reflections and an effort to compare two large bodies of evidence, actually one large body of evidence which regards sleep, and a small body of evidence. The entire field is pretty much in this room, which has to do with ayahuasca. And this, for me at least, it started really in 2006, when I had been back to Brazil for a year, from being many years in the US, and I was visiting my good friend Draulio de Araújo, who is there in yellow, and we were discussing, having a relaxed conversation about what could be a model of dreaming. Dreams are something that are really interesting for me. Draulio is also interested in sleep and dreams, and he had a contact at that time with people from Santo Daime. And then we said, well, what if we came up with an experiment that could test something about the imagery properties of the ayahuasca experience? So could ayahuasca be, as a potent psychoactive substance, could it be a model for dreaming? At least that was a motivation for us. And that, of course, resonates a preoccupation of somebody else 100 years ago. Freud also thought that he could have a royal road to understand consciousness, but not through a substance, but through a natural state of the mind. So if we're going to talk about dreaming, we need to talk about sleep. When did sleep appear? So about 800 million years ago, life began in this planet, and we can be really sure that at that time, these originally unicellular organisms were already subjected to a day-night cycle. So circadian effects are at the root of the behavior that we call sleep. 360 million years ago, animals that resemble insects began to appear. This is the beginning of the insect radiation. And based on the behavior that insects have now, like fruit flies, we can speculate that slow wave sleep, this quiescent form of sleep, was evolved around that time, so pretty old, and probably for very basic reasons of conservation of energy and replenishment of biomolecules, rather than more complicated stuff like cognition. About 100 million years ago, mammals began to really radiate and gave origin to many of the groups that exist today. And in mammals that exist today, the sleep is also accompanied by another state, which we call rapid eye movement sleep, or paradoxical sleep if you're coming from France, which is this very active state of sleep in which the brain looks like it's awaking, but it's in fact in an offline state. So those two complementary phases appeared many million years ago, and we still don't understand very well what is the function that they play. A long time after that, less than 1 million years ago probably, our ancestors started to develop complex behavior that give origin to the culture that we have nowadays. So in particular, the use of tools and the beginning of art, or whatever you want to call the remains that were left by our ancestors on those caverns and caves throughout Europe and elsewhere. So at that point, we start to have some direct indication of the kind of mind that is undergoing those states. because before we can only speculate. But now here we start to get a feeling that they start to be able to use icons. So here we have, in addition to the hands, you can see a bison. Can you guys see the bison drawn there? So this is an icon. This is a very simple form of sign that communicates through similarity, right? So what sort of mentality did those hominids have? We can probably be sure that in the past several 100,000 years, they were having two kinds of experience that is not the regular waking experience, right? They were probably most certainly having dreams, and they were very likely, although we don't have the evidence, they were very likely using psychoactive substances. And what dreams and psychoactive substances provide is a detachment from the immediate reality and access to this other world. What is it made of, right? Be as it may, we know that through dreams and through the use of psychoactive substances, our ancestors eventually got here. So culture was developed. What dreams and psychoactive substances provided, based on, if you read the Bible, if you read the Gilgamesh stories, if you read the Vedas or the I Ching or whatever old text, you will see that it had to do with planning the future. It had to do with integrating past information towards goals for the future. Whatever you want to do, achieve in the future, dreams had to do with this. And also the shamanic trances induced by substances also are related to that. We don't have the details about how this evolved. I mean, it's very hard to inform the minds just based on written texts. But we know that much more recently, at the beginning of the 20th century, this field of neuroscience began to coalesce. And what was neuroscience back 100 and so years ago? So perhaps the most concrete and safe thing to study, something that people could rely on, was anatomy. So anatomy doesn't change a lot over time, right? And the founding father of neuroscience is Santiago Ramón y Cajal. So he discovered the neuron, and he started to draw neurons, and he started to draw circuits and come up with a lot of conclusions of stuff that actually he couldn't really be sure. For example, the directionality of the flow of information in the brain is something that he inferred from the anatomy. Around the same time, physiology was developing. Sherrington and Adrian, the founding fathers of neurophysiology, they were also dealing with something concrete, spikes, action potentials, right? Something that you can measure, you can count. They were figuring out that if you put a weight on a muscle, and if you record neurons that are innervating that muscle, you're going to see a firing rate increase. So they were also doing something very quantitative and solid, seemingly. And then you had a guy like Freud. And he was, instead of studying neurons or the shape of neurons and the way that neurons function, he was studying the way that complex systems, complex collections of cells that we call brains, that we call a body, would produce evidence. What sort of evidence? Well, actually, his detractors would say just blah, 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 words. So by staying in a setting that allows for free association, the Freudian setting, the psychoanalytical setting, people would produce some evidence, some behavioral evidence that was not considered to be scientific by most of science for many, many years, but still yielded many, many insights into human behavior. In particular, around the turn of the century, Freud published The Interpretation of Dreams. And in this book, he came up with several concepts that I want to examine here with you today. He proposed that dreams contain day residues, that dreams somehow reflect the stuff that happens during waking. He said that desire is the motor of dreams, and he was criticized for putting things in that poetic manner. He said that dreams are conglomerates of psychic formations, and you start thinking, well, maybe people were right to criticize him, because what does he mean by that? Conglomerations of psychic formations. We don't know, or do we know? And then he said that a very famous phrase that most likely everybody here heard before. He said that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. But he didn't say what the unconscious is. And that is the source of a lot of debate and confusion. We'll try to, through this talk, revisit those concepts with the biology of nowadays and see if those assertions make sense. So if we are to describe the phenomenology of dreams, and this is something that Freud did very well in this book, we have to admit that dreams are fragmented, they are bizarre, they show condensation of time and space, right? Several operations, several logical, or if you want, illogical operations on something that is the basic framework of reality, the waking life. So in dreams, we deal with waking events and memories of waking events, but they get to be mixed up in very interesting and unpredictable ways. Another thing that we need to recognize is oops, I don't want to connect. Thank you. We need to recognize that dreams very often involve anxiety of some sort. In fact, if you read the literature, about 50% of dream reports, 50, 60, 40, around there, involve anxious feelings. Not necessarily nightmares, but this feeling of incompletude, something that you want to achieve and you haven't achieved. How many people here have had dreams in which you want to achieve something or arrive at a place or find a person and that hasn't happened throughout the dream? Can you please raise your hands? Thank you. So this has been published in the past 50 years. It's very clear that dreams have something to do with searching for a goal and often not getting there. But also in some cases getting there, and this is something that Freud described as the wish fulfillment dream. So achieving the goal. This is also in dreams. And this is why Freud departed from hypnosis and in fact used dreams as the royal road to his practice. So people would come to the psychoanalytical setting and by free association revisit those experiences, those very private experiences, and come up with, in the attempt to come up with insights that could cure them of whatever problem they had. So I'm not going to go into the details, but the fact is that Freud lost really scientific credibility, in part for his and his followers' attitudes, and in great part also due to the scientific establishment attitude. And in the 1950s, Azerinsky, Kleitman, and Dement discovered REM sleep. In hindsight, you could say, well, that was probably a very big impulse to the Freudian tradition, but in fact, it wasn't. Most people saw the discovery of REM sleep as something that would diminish the importance of dreams and increase the importance of something concrete that you can measure, like a physiological state. Okay, so the discovery that during the night we go through a state in which we have very high brain activity, our eyes move very fast, and we frequently experience vivid dreams. This was not taken as something that could enhance psychoanalytical dreaming research, but in fact something that would say that this was not important at all. And in the past 60 years, most researchers in neuroscience have been bashing Freud as much as they can. Since then, we discovered that sleep is composed of different states. So there's an initial state that we call the hypnagogic state, that feels almost like REM sleep or dreaming. And then you have stage 2, which takes a long time, and it's basically a slowing down of the brain. Then stages 3 and 4 actually are now clumped together in the new classification. It's basically what we call slow wave sleep. The brain is functioning at very low speed with very high amplitude. And if you wake people up during that phase, they typically report thoughts, but not dreams. And then REM sleep, or stage 5 here, in which you frequently, at least adults, will report dreams. Now, Freud didn't say that dreams or sleep is important for learning. He didn't say that. In fact, Jung was closer to saying it. He said, the dream prepares the dreamer for the future, for the next day. But if you admit that memories are acquired during waking and they reoccur during dreamings, and if learning is something that occurs during waking, then you might as well think that sleep is involved with learning. And indeed, this is the case. This was shown for the first time in 1924 by Jenkins and D'Alembert. They were performing a very simple experiment in psychology, a very classical experiment, which is the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. So late in the 19th century, Ebbinghaus showed that if you learn some syllables that do not exist in your language, over time you forget them with a very characteristic exponential decay. Okay, and this is true in humans, in rats, in bees. This is a general law of learning. You forget. Okay? What they did was to replicate this classical experiment, but they had the subjects either stay awake, going to some college class, or sleep in between the acquisition and the testing. And what you see is that sleep protected those memories. It's much better to sleep than to go to classes if you want to remember stuff that is not in the classes. So this finding was not followed up until the 60s, for reasons that I don't quite understand. But then in the 60s, there was a surge of interest in this kind of study, using animal models, mice and rats in particular. And this happened in the US and it happened in France, who were actually competing for who was to own REM sleep / paradoxical sleep. And then in the 70s, a lot of people published papers like this, saying sleep deprivation impairs learning. And then there was this discussion about the confounds of sleep deprivation and whether this is a stress or not. There's some protocols in the 90s. Bob Stickle in Harvard was able to show that you can discount stress in your preparations, making some arrangements so that you can convince people that it's really sleep that is doing the trick. But why is sleep important for learning? What is going on during sleep that can subserve a memory function? The first thing that is happening is what we call memory reactivation or memory reverberation. And there are many examples of that. I brought one that for me is particularly clear and cute, which is that of zebra finches, Australian birds that exist in every songbird lab here in the US. You can see those same effects in mammals, okay? But I brought this example because it's particularly clear. There's no math, no transformation of the data to convince you that there is a reactivation. And so it goes like this. This is the sonogram of zebrafinch song. The animal is singing syllables here. This is time, this is frequency, and the brightness is the power of the vocalization. You see one syllable, another one, a small one, and another one, okay? Something very sexy for female zebrafinches, like meh, 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 meh. This is what they're singing. Now, if you stick an electrode in a nucleus called RA, which is a descending nucleus, a descending motor nucleus that projects to the syrinx, to the nuclei that control the syrinx, the vocal organ, what you're going to record when the animal sings are action potentials from a given neuron that are very stereotyped. So if the animal sings 100 times, this neuron will fire always for the first syllable with 3 bursts, and then will be silent for the second syllable. Then it's going to fire bursts here at the beginning of the 3rd syllable, and then again and again. So there's a signature. Each neuron has a particular pattern of activation at specific moments with regard to what's going on in terms of the behavior. Now, what is really cool is, and this is work done in Chicago in Margolish's lab, what is really cool is what happens when the animal is asleep. And this is what happens. So you can see here, with no mathematical tricks, that the pattern that the neuron had, the firing pattern that relates to singing, reoccurs with very small changes during sleep. So you could almost say, well, I can now confirm that the animal is somehow dreaming of this very important behavior, which is the bird's own song. Okay? This was shown in humans, in monkeys, in rats. So there's a vast literature about this in the past 20 years. We can also trace this reverberation at a lower level, not the electrophysiological level, but the molecular level. What sorts of molecules are active inside the cells that have to do with learning? So these are experiments that I did myself. And I studied two groups of rats, really. Rats that never left their home cages, in a very boring situation, nothing new to learn, and animals that were exposed to a sort of rat Disneyland with card boxes connected by PVC tubing and lots of new kinds of food. Very scientific stuff, that allows animals to be engaged and happy and stimulate their cortex and their hippocampus as they explore. So after we did that, we brought them in another chamber, recorded their sleep, waited some hours, and when they entered specific sleep states, slow wave sleep, REM sleep, as compared to waking, we looked into the expression of a gene called ZIF268. You don't need to remember this. This is a gene that is involved with the consolidation of memories. It's a key gene to transform a short-term memory trace into a long-lasting memory trace. It's typically expressed during waking, right? We acquire memories during waking. So we ask, is this gene also active during sleep? And our findings were very exciting for us. What we found, not for the rats, what we found was that when the animals were in the boring situation, the expression of the gene is very strong in the cortex. This is one hemisphere of the rat brain. And in the hippocampus, this is an in situ hybridization for this gene using radioactive probes. During waking, you see strong expression of the gene. But during slow wave sleep, the expression is very much reduced, and so it is during REM sleep. However, when the animal was exposed to novelty some hours before, the expression is still high during waking, it's decreased during slow wave sleep, but then it's reinduced, it's increased again during REM sleep. This is the first demonstration that there is a molecular day residue, not just an electrophysiological, not just what happens at the membrane level with the potentials, but if you go inside the nucleus, there's a switch in the gene expression program so as to generate long-term memories during REM sleep, but only when there's something new to learn, okay? So in the past few years, many people have been joining this field of study, and it's now pretty clear that sleep is important for learning. Now, what is happening in the human brain, not the rat brain, when we are in REM sleep? There's still some controversy, I would say, because people use different methods, fMRI, SPECT, EEG, you come up with not exactly the same findings. So even though there's a lot of people interested in this, there's still some room for debate, but mostly people would agree on this. So there's some areas that are more active, which are here in red, like motor premotor cortex, occipital areas, visual cortex, but actually there's a big debate about whether it involves the primary visual areas, area 17 in the human, okay? So most studies are saying the activation does not reach the occipital pole. It gets those secondary, tertiary areas, okay? And then the amygdala, the hippocampus, thalamus, of course, the pons, which generates REM sleep, basal forebrain, and anterior cingulates. So all those regions are active during dreaming, during REM sleep, sorry. Also, some areas show decreased activity, in particular the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the inferior parietal cortex, and the posterior cingulate cortex, the precuneus. What is interesting here, if people have lesions of the extrastriate visual regions, this is work by Mark Solms in England, people will lose the ability to dream. They will enter REM sleep all right, but they will not have dreams. So you need these extrastriate areas in order to have dreams. This is a necessity. What can we infer based on this pattern of deactivation? These are regions involved with executive function, with planning of actions, and with having your own feeling of your own body, okay? So having a deactivation of these regions here may explain why we, first of all, do not control very well the actions during the dreams, and may explain why we accept the bizarre, weird things that happen as okay. Okay, we're not so much in control. The fact that we have a lot of activation in the amygdala and the hippocampus has to do, or is interpreted as, evidence for a substrate for the emotionality of dreams. Now, the emotionality of dreams is somewhat contentious. Some people will say the dreams are very emotional. Some people will say that, in fact, you are sort of detached from your emotions during dreaming. And in my own experience, my introspective experience, you can have both. So dreams probably change in flavor depending on what you're living. Right? One important thing that we should note is that until very recently, most researchers said that dreaming was the equivalent to REM sleep. 10 minutes, that's not good. So if they were equivalent, if you were able to abolish dreaming, REM sleep should disappear as well. And then Mark Solms did many neurological investigations to find which regions, when lesioned, would abolish dreaming but not abolish REM sleep. And he came up with a conclusion that VTA, which is the core of what we call the reward punishment system, is necessary for dreaming to occur. People that have lesions of VTA or of the dopaminergic axons or projecting axons that leave VTA, what we call the mesocortical limbic circuit, when this is lesioned, people lose the ability to dream even though they have REM sleep. Okay? And what happens in animals that have this circuit lesion is that they become anhedonic. They do not search rewards and they do not avoid punishment in the same way. So the idea that desire is the motor of dreams, something that Freud defended, based on this kind of finding, seems to be very true. If you do not have the circuits that allow you to desire what is good and avoid what is bad, you also don't dream. So dreams are not just the reactivation of memories or the reverberation of memories, but the reverberation of memories with a purpose, towards a goal. And that, coming back to your answer, how many dreams you had in which you had a goal that was unfulfilled, right? This is very typical of dreams. More recently, we gained insights into a special kind of dreaming that is commonly associated with the ayahuasca experience, which is called lucid dreaming. How many people here have had a lucid dream? Great. So those are dreams in which you know you are dreaming and you can control the dream partially or fully. Okay? And during those dreams, this is work done by Ursula Voss and Alan Hobson, there is an increase in gamma frequencies in the frontal regions in comparison to REM sleep. So it's almost like an intermediate state between waking and REM sleep. This would account perhaps for the feeling of more control that you have when you are having a lucid dream. We have work in our own lab done by Sergio Rolim during his PhD and finished last year, unpublished yet, in which we sort of replicate the same data. There's more activation in frontal regions in high frequencies. We also have more activation in the occipital regions for alpha frequencies. So somewhat congruent with that. Now, there's something about dreams that has been perhaps the most important aspect for artists, which is the issue of creativity. Dreaming has been associated with increased creativity. And that's a report by many artists. In particular, Salvador Dali, I brought him here this painting called The Dream Caused by the Flight of a Bee Around a Pomegranate 1 second before waking. It's almost like a material method of a paper, right? He had a method to doze with a very heavy silver spoon in his hands, and when he finally lost the muscular tone, the spoon would fall and he would be waking up and then paint. So creativity is boosted by dreaming. And this also influences science in a big way. You're probably all familiar with the story of Auguste Kekulé that was stuck with the number of carbons that goes into benzene, and he could not fit into any linear structure. And he came up with the benzene ring by dreaming about the uruburu, an alchemic symbol of the snake that eats its own tail. Perhaps more important effect of dream on science is the discovery of the periodic table that Mendeleev attributed to dreaming. And a very known case is the story of Otto Lewy that came up with the experiments that proved the existence of chemical transmission in the heart in a dream. In fact, he came up with the idea in a dream, woke up, forgot it, then the next night he had the same dream, and then woke up, went to the lab and finished, and actually got the Nobel Prize for this experiment. But it's very difficult to capture this phenomenon in a laboratory because it's a one-of-a-kind phenomenon. When you have an insight, when you come up with an idea, it's an N of one. You get it, boom, that's it. How are you going to replicate that? So people in Lübeck, the group of Jan Born in Germany, they were able to come up with a very nice experiment. I'm not going to go into the details because I only have 5 minutes and a lot of slides to go. But basically what they did was to get a psychological test called the number reduction test that is very standard in psychology, but they had a trick. They had an implicit structure. They had some information that was hidden. And what they found is that when people had access to sleep, they were much more likely to come up with the answer, to understand the implicit information. And this is what they attribute to restructuring of memories. If you come up with a new idea, you have to admit, if you were within the physical realm, that this new idea came from your old ideas that were somehow remixed. okay? And they're showing that sleep promotes that. Now that brings us to ayahuasca. One thing that people often report about ayahuasca, and Benny Shannon wrote a piece on this, is the fact that ayahuasca improves creativity and improves improvisation, especially, for those that are practiced or trained, right? So I don't have to explain in this track what ayahuasca is or what ayahuasca does, right? When we got interested in this, when I started to collaborate with Draulio de Araújo on this issue, we were interested in particular on the mirações, the visions that somehow resemble dreams. Now, what is remarkable about those mirações is that they do resemble dreams in the sense that you have subjects, you have entities, complex concepts, a person, a snake, a frog, a river, things that have a very complete existence in the outer world. They are there. But in addition to that thing that you also have in dreams, there's a lot of patterning. There's a lot of a very rich quality for vision, in particular textures, right? How many people here have experienced that? Can I just get a feeling? Okay. It's interesting. I couldn't find a paper that gives those numbers. I was talking to Brian, can we get a paper that gives a reference to this, to the patterning quality of ayahuasca? And there's nothing published, so this is a big avenue for new research. This idea that sleep has to do with ayahuasca experience is natural, given what it is. So actually here we have Jordi Riba in the audience, and certainly the leading guy in this field, in the biomedical aspects of the ayahuasca experience. And he was interested in this, and he assessed the amounts of sleep after the ayahuasca intake. And he came up with a very surprising answer. He said, you found that, he didn't say, he found with numbers that the latency to REM sleep is increased after ayahuasca. And the total time in REM sleep is less, right? So this is counterintuitive. If ayahuasca is like dreaming, why is it that REM sleep is less and it takes longer to kick in? One caveat here is that the study was done, the sleep was recorded at night, but the intake was at noon. So we don't know what really would have happened if they had been recorded during the afternoon. Possibly they wouldn't go to sleep, at least that's what Jordi observed. But we also don't know what would have happened if they had taken the ayahuasca at night, which often occurs during rituals. So this is an open, interesting question. Is REM sleep reduced many hours after intake as a rebound of something that was increased before, or just because it was decreased throughout? We don't know, something we need to assess. One interesting aspect of sleep is the effect it has on learning. And this is something that very recently Jordi has started to address. He talked about this yesterday. I'm not going to go into the details, but he showed yesterday that people, experienced users, do better on ayahuasca on the Tower of London than they do without ayahuasca. So that could be related to those findings in sleep. We don't know. He also showed that in a working memory test, the experienced users without ayahuasca do better than non-experienced users. Is that a reflection of increased learning? We don't know. So learning, to assess learning after ayahuasca intake is an open research question. And if the effects are there, there would be a similarity with sleep. My time is up, but I'm almost done. Thank you. Thank you. I'm not going to go into the details, but it's important to remember that ayahuasca is a very complex inebriant. It has DMT, which will act on different kinds of receptors, which are widespread, have a widespread distribution in the brain, and also increases the levels of monoamines big time. So when people I used to do this, the same, say, well, ayahuasca is like psilocybin, it's like LSD, but in fact it isn't. It's considerably more complex. And Jordi has gained a lot of insight to doing electroencephalographic recordings, showing that the effects are mostly concentrated here around 2 hours after intake. More recently has done work using SPECT to find regions that in the resting state, when people are quiet with their eyes closed in a quiet environment, what regions get mostly activated? And he found the cingulus, the anterior cingulus, the medial frontal gyrus, inferior frontal gyrus, the insula, the amygdala, and the parahippocampal gyrus. Okay? I'm going to compare this with a task and a technique that is different. This is work that Braulio showed on Friday in detail. I'm not going to go in detail on this, but this is people imagining. They have their eyes closed, but they're making the intention to imagine an image that they had just seen. And everything is dark. It's just the imagination that seems to be driving those changes. And we see activations in the occipital pole in regions V1, V2, V3, the very early regions of vision, and also the extrastriate regions. And we see activation in the parahippocampal area, and we see a frontopolar activation. In particular, and something that I want to call your attention to, the only region that showed activation that was proportional to the mental changes that we could measure was V1. So this is a primary visual area. This is not supposed to be involved in anything when you have your eyes closed, okay? And still, what we found is that when people have their eyes closed and they're trying to imagine, V1 is as active as if the person had the eyes open. So when people say, I'm seeing things, it's not a joke. They are. They are seeing it as vividly as if they had their eyes open. Now, as I said, this is a field that is still small, and it's hard because we have a few papers, and if we want to really compare them, it's difficult. The techniques are different, the people are different, the way we did things are different. So what we need to do is do more studies, and we need to do studies of different things on the same subject. So the same subject goes to sleep and then goes through ayahuasca. This is something that Braulio is conducing the next year with hopefully 80 subjects. But this is a summary of what's out there. So if you get George's work on EEG, he found activation of middle and superior temporal gyrus, precuneus, ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex, parahippocampal cortex. Using SPECT, he found frontal cortex, ACC, the same insular, parahippocampal cortex, and hippocampus. And Braulio and our team, we found occipital gyrus, fusiform gyrus, lingual gyrus, parahippocampal gyrus, the same, cuneus, middle frontal gyrus, superior frontal gyrus, precuneus, middle temporal gyrus. So some overlap in those findings, not complete, but some, okay? If you compare with the literature in REM sleep, which is a literature derived from SPECT and fMRI, we find activation of medial prefrontal cortex, extrastriate cortex, ACC, hippocampus, and amygdala. So this is similar, this is similar, this is maybe similar, maybe not, depending on which paper you're looking at. And the deactivation, dorsolateral prefrontal, orbitofrontal, inferior parietal, precuneus. You see the precuneus here, and here's an activation, here's an activation. So we can, if we are to take these informations as face value, on their face value, we can say that there's a partial overlap on the systems that involve ayahuasca intake and REM sleep. So I want to conclude very briefly, 2 minutes more, okay? What we're proposing here is that ayahuasca is allowing you to, by activating visual regions and also temporal regions related to memory, allow you to revisit your memories in a very vivid manner. And this is somewhat what you try to do in a psychoanalytical setting, okay? So imagine when you're born, you don't have a lot of memories, you have very few innate memories. So your landscape of memories is very flat. As you age, you acquire a lot of memories. Right? How many different rivers exist, possible rivers exist here, right? Many. But then when you go to sleep, activity will bombard the system, water will flow, and even though it falls randomly, it will not flow randomly when it hits the ground. It will flow according to your memories. So if you have a trauma, it's because that's a very deep river. That's why the activity always flows from there. Or through there. And ayahuasca probably gives you the same kinds of thing. However, there are a few differences, and sorry, but I just need to finish this. When we say the dreams contain days residues, we can say safely the dreams reverberate memories at the electrophysiological molecular levels. What can we say about ayahuasca? We haven't done those experiments. This is tough to do. Desire is the mode of dreams. Dreams require the activation of reward, punishment, VTA circuits. What can we say about ayahuasca? We actually don't know what the VTA is doing during ayahuasca because it's a very small region, right? I don't know, maybe Jordi will tell me. Dreams are conglomerate of psychic formations. We can say the dreams comprise memory complexes. They come together, not one single memory, but many complexes. But ayahuasca does activate those complexes, but also something more about the patterning of images, and I'm going to talk about this in the next slide. And dreams that the Royal wrote to the unconscious, they grant access to the memory database. So this is the notion that the unconscious is just the memory database with all the possible combinations of memories. And that's what's feeding the ayahuasca experience as much as it's feeding the dreaming experience. We know very well that dreams are mostly visual and somewhat auditory. These data are missing for ayahuasca. This is research that needs to be done. That is very easy to do and hasn't been done yet. We don't know. And finally, before Brian kills me, how can we explain this exacerbated patterning? I think that it has to do with something that James Kent has been proposing in the psychedelic information theory, that the processing at the low levels is disrupted, and there's some information about this in George's work showing that the pair-pulse inhibition is less. So this is probably generating confusion or change in the way we process at very early stages the information. There's another issue. Those early areas are themselves like mandalas. If this is images from the primary visual cortex, this is orientation maps, these are ocular dominance columns, these are blobs for color vision. So probably when we have the ayahuasca experience, we are overwhelmed by activity in the lower levels, so we're sort of seeing the architecture, okay? And I want to finish with this image, nice image by Clancy Klavener that illustrates this concept, that perhaps the similarity between dreaming and ayahuasca is partial because during dreaming, we don't have activation of those primary visual areas. So you only dream about concepts, but because in ayahuasca you have all mixed. So you have a concept, you have a person, you also have a lot of patterning, which is beautiful, nice to experience, but also important to understand. Thank you very much.